So I'm so glad to be here today, accompanied by my colleague Bruce Robertson. I'm so glad because, as you may know, I'm a University of Melbourne alumni, and it's a really great feeling to present uh, about energy finance stuff to my former university fellows. So, Bruce, you want to introduce yourself briefly, or shall I start?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Bruce Robertson. I work at the Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis as an analyst for gas and LNG. I was a fund manager and investment analyst for 16 years prior to moving up to the country and becoming a farmer. In the last 5 years, I've worked for the Institute doing gas and LNG. Milad joined us this year to do some analysis as well. So I'll hand over to Milad because it's really his presentation.
Thanks, Bruce. So Daniel, how do I get to the full screen mode? I just forgot.
You just click on the slides.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
It's maybe, given the current setup, it may be more convenient. I don't know if you can see the red buttons and have the full screen view. People can choose themselves whether to be in full screen view or not. So they'll.
Oh, okay, yeah.
They won't.
So let me see.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think it's okay. Yeah, I'm doing it this way. So yeah, I'm gonna just want to quote Adam that he said we still need to make good choices. So I'm gonna talk about the investment choice today, and I just want you to think about as an investor. So suppose that you want to invest in the energy sector, more specifically in the electricity sector, and you have a bunch of options. I mean, different power plants to produce electricity. So you have, for example, renewables, wind, solar, or fossil fuels like coal, gas, and other options. So to decide, we may think of different factors that affect our investment decision. So first and foremost would be the financial side of the thing, which is how profitable are all these options. Or you may think of some, for example, social side of this decision, like, for example, how many jobs it would create for the society, whether it is a sustainable choice to invest in or not, or even a step ahead and think about the environmental aspect of that, whether it's in line with the clean future, or whether it's a polluting option, or what about the next generation, what about the other habitats, and all of those things. So for the sake of this presentation, suppose that I am a pure profit maximizer as an investor, just as an assumption. So it means that for the moment, I want to ignore the social and environmental aspect of this decision, which I shouldn't, we all know. But we want to see, even if you want to think only from the financial perspective, what would be the good option to invest in when you have a couple of options of different power plants, renewables and fossil-based. Okay, so if you want to think financially, you'll be thinking about the profit. So what is profit here? So you establish a power plant and then you make some revenue. So your total revenue minus your total cost would be your profit. And what is the goods or service that you want to sell? It is electricity. So for each unit of electricity, you can make money. So the price of electricity times the quantity of electricity that you're going to produce through the whole lifetime of that power plant, minus the total cost you incur through the whole life of that power plant, would be your profit. So to make these different options comparable, let's normalize the profits per each quantity of the electricity. So by normalizing, I mean, I want to end up with a profit per each unit of electricity that I'm going to produce with each different options. So for normalizing that, I just need to divide the both sides of the equation by the quantity of the electricity that I'm going to produce, and I'll end up with this equation in the bottom. So the profit per each electricity unit I'm going to produce would be the price of the electricity minus the total cost over the total quantity of the electricity. And as a simplifying assumption, which is a fair assumption for this presentation, we can just assume that if you produce electricity using each of these technologies, whether it's a coal power plant or a wind power plant or a solar one, you'll sell it to the grid, and the price is the same for all of them, just as a simplifying assumption. So you can put aside the price for a moment and just focus on the total cost per quantity of the equation. So the main thing that we need to know about these different options is their cost their cost that they have when, for example, you want to produce 1 unit of electricity out of them. So the lower the cost, the more the profit. So I just need to find the low cost options, the lowest cost option actually. So that would be the better option because it would make me more money or profit at the end of the day. Okay, so far so good. So the only thing that I need to calculate when I want to decide, just based on the financial side of the decision, it's this criteria: total cost per quantity. We call it levelized cost of electricity or levelized cost of energy, LCOE. This is the criteria that any energy authority or almost any investor around the world who want to consider different options as investment options in the energy sector would consider. So they just look for different reports, different scientific reports that calculate this LCOE, and they would decide based on this levelized cost of electricity. The cheaper the LCOE, the more profitable the power plant. So what you need to know from now on is just we need to find the lowest LCOE out of these different options. We want to see which of these options has the lowest cost of electricity production. Okay. So let's look at this LCOE formula again. It was total cost that you'll incur during the lifetime of power plant over the total electricity that you're going to produce. For example, in the 20 or 30 years of a lifetime of a power plant. So the total cost could be estimated sort of with a high accuracy because, we have the historical cost of, for example, same power plants, for example, especially in the fossil sector. So we can estimate the operation and the maintenance cost of the future and all of those things. And what I'm telling here is actually we can estimate it with a high level of accuracy, but in the denominator is the place that we've got a problem. So you have to calculate the total electricity that you're going to produce with this power plant in the next 20 or 30 years of its lifetime. And as you may notice, this LCOE thing is very sensitive to the amount of this total electricity in the denominator here. So, okay. So I want to calculate this total electricity, for example, for a different options that I've got at the bottom of the page, okay? For simplicity, suppose that we have a wind power plant with 1 megawatt of capacity. Megawatt is the unit of the capacity of the power plants. Just 1 megawatt. I consider all of them as 1 megawatt 1 megawatt power plants to make our life easier when we want to compare them. So we have a similar same capacity of power plants of different technologies, and we want to calculate the total electricity they can produce, for example, in 1 year for the moment. So what I need to do is just a 1 megawatt. I just multiplying this 1 megawatt times by the 8,760 hours. What is this number? This is the total number of hours that we have in a whole year. Okay, so we've got 365 days, and each day has 24 hours. So if you multiply them, you'll end up with this number. Okay, so if I have 1 megawatt capacity of the power plant, no matter, what technology it has, and I multiply it by these hours of that we have in a year, I'll end up with this electricity production, which is 8,760 megawatt hour. This megawatt hour is the unit of electricity produced. Okay, so for example, in a very, very simple setting, I can calculate the total electricity to be produced out of each of these power plants, coal power plants, wind, and others. But the problem is, it's not realistic to consider a power plant to work all over each and every hour of a year. All of these 8,760 hours of a year. It's not realistic. So the problem is, how could we estimate or how could we calculate the actual number of hours that a power plant could produce in a year, in a given year? And that's the place we define a concept which we call the capacity factor or utilization rate. What is the capacity factor? So the power plant's actual generation output over its maximum output in a year is the capacity factor. In a very simple terms, if a capacity factor of your power plant is 100%, it means that it can produce electricity in each and every hour of a year. If it is 80%, it means it can produce electricity 80% of the time out of that numbers in a number of hours in a year. If it is 20%, it can produce 20% of the time. So this capacity factor is a critical factor to consider when you want to calculate, how many, units of electricity I'm going to produce in 1 year, or in a longer time, in 20 years or next 30 years, during the whole lifetime of the power plant I want to invest in. For example, now having this, for example, consider that we have a power plant with 80% capacity factor. I'm gonna calculate, and its whole lifetime is 20 years. I'm gonna calculate the total electricity in the next 20 years that I can produce by investing in this, for example, specific type of power plant. So the capacity of the power plant times the capacity factor times the hours that I have during the whole 20 years. In other words, if we have for example, 1 megawatt of power plant, so it would be 1 times, consider just as an assumption, our power plant has a 80% capacity factor times 0.8 times 20 years times the number of hours that we have in each year. And you'll end up with this number. So you can produce this, about 140,000 of megawatt hour during the whole 20 years of a lifetime of power plant. But there's a problem in this calculation. So as just Adam mentioned, there are a very famous energy authorities and mainstream energy authorities or institutions that they are widely cited around the world, and almost all of the investors, all of the researchers just rely on their calculations. For example, you may heard of International Energy Agency, IEA, or for example, for US, we have US Energy Information Administration, EIA, or for example, in Australia, we have Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, which we call it CSIRO, which produce a a yearly report on these LCOEs for Australian investors, which the report called Gen Cost, Generation Cost, or Gen Cost, and it provides you with a LCOE, or the cost of electricity production with different technologies. So if you look at that document, you can decide that, okay, this, for example, this option is a low cost option. This one is more expensive, so I would go for the lowest cost option. So, but almost all of these energy authorities actually are relied on a false or flawed pre-assumption. They consider a constant capacity factor during the whole lifetime of a power plant. In other words, they assume that, for example, if you establish a wind power plant, or if you establish, let's say, the fossil power plant today, and consider that it has, for example, 20 years lifetime, it will operate by 80% of its maximum capacity in all of these years. So this is the constant trend of the capacity factor they assume. And this is what I mentioned as a flawed assumption. It's not correct. How do I know that? Just look at the historical data. So if you look at, for example, the capacity factor of the coal-fired power plants in Australia, you will get this number from 2011, about 10 years ago, up to now. It started with 80% capacity factor, but it is declining, okay? There might be some ups and downs, but the overall trend is declining. And the question is what it would be like in the next 10 years, next 20 years, next 30 years. So it would be declining. So the general trend is declining, not maybe in a linear term. There might be some ups and downs on non-linearity, but the thing is it's declining. But what we've got as an assumption in all of those reports is a constant trend. So the red line is the assumption of the CSIRO, for example, for coal-fired power plants, or not just CSIRO, other energy authorities. But what we've got in reality is a declining trend. So what happens here if we just consider a constant capacity factor? If we consider that these power plants would operate with the same and very high capacity factor during the next 20 years, for example, we are simply overestimating its production, the electricity production, because it's gonna produce much less electricity compared to the state that we've got for example, constant capacity factor. And for example, if we consider, let's say, for example, in next 10 years, the coal-fired power plants in Australia operate at the 25 or 30% of the time, so it would produce it would produce much less electricity than if we assume that it would operate with the 80% of the maximum output. So it's simple as it is, but this is the mainstream assumption behind these capacity factor trends. And this is not just about the coal-fired power plants. We have the same story about just, for example, about the coal-fired power plants. It's not just about Australia. We have the same story all over the world. Just look at these trends. This is the capacity factor trends of coal-fired power plants in Australia, China, US, and UK. So, for example, in UK, you can see what a sharp decline is. And because, UK is planning to abandon the coal-fired power plants in the next couple of years. So it's not correct to consider, for example, a constant capacity factor for coal power plants in UK and say, okay, for example, if I invest in a coal-fired power plants in US, I'll be producing with, for example, 80% of the maximum capacity in the next 20 years. No, it's not true. The capacity that you will use in the next couple of years would be zero, virtually. And there are a lot of reasons behind that, which is not the topic of this discussion, but I think Adam and actually his colleague just mentioned in their report. For example, we have technological disruptions. There are, a tsunami of the renewables coming towards this fossil sector. We've got batteries, solar, winds. We've got social awareness and social pressure. We've got environmental regulation that, force some of these countries to just decrease or reduce their emission. For example, we may heard about the Paris Agreement. All of the countries around the world are committed to decrease their emission, and move away from fossil fuels. So it's a declining trend all over the world. Not just coal, but also gas. This trend is the capacity factor of gas power plants in Australia, and it is declining. What is the assumption of the CSIRO? Here is the assumption of CSIRO, which is 60%. For example, if one invests today, it considers a 60% capacity factor or utilization rate for a gas power plant up until the next 20 years. Not only it's overestimated right now because it's currently about 40%, but also it's overestimating the future utilization rate of the gas power plants. And we have the same story in the US. I used the graph by the Rethink Institute. Adam and his colleague calculated this graph for the US. And again, the green one is the realistic forecast of the capacity factor of coal power plants up until 2035 in the US, and the blue one is what Energy Information Administrator of the US forecasted, which is not a very realistic one. So let's step back and see what happens if we overestimate the CF. Okay. Now we know that we are overestimating the capacity factor all over the world. What happens? When you're overestimating the CF, you are actually overestimating the total electricity that you're going to produce, because, if you're overestimating this guy here, you're actually overestimating the total electricity that you're going to produce. And if you overestimate that, it means you're underestimating the LCOE. So the larger the denominator in this fraction, the lower the LCOE. Okay, so you're actually make it cheaper if you consider, if you overestimate a capacity factor, you're make it, cheaper than it really is. You're saying that actually it's gonna produce more electricity, so the levelized cost would be lower, so it's cheaper option, for example, which is not in reality because you're overestimating here is CFU. And finally, you are saying that you're overestimating CF, underestimating LCOE, and finally you're overestimating the profitability. So in a very simple terms, you are saying that these power plants will be produced this amount of electricity, which is an overestimated amount, and you're misleading an investor because then it thinks that it's the LCOE is lower, and it's a better option. It's a more attractive option in terms of its profitability because it has the lowest cost. This is what happens just by a very simple flawed assumption. And for example, in US, this is again from the Rethink research. What you see here is, the yellow and the blue is the LCOE of the solar and wind, which is around $0.1 per kilowatt hour. So I just talked about the megawatt hour. It's just another unit. If you multiply this kilowatt hour by 1,000, it would be megawatt hour. So it's not a big deal. The gray one is the EIA's LCOE. I mean, the LCOE based on the EIA's flood assumption, which consider a high constant capacity factor. So it makes it cheaper. But if you just make it realistic with a realistic forecast of a declining capacity factor, your LCOE would jump around here. up until 2035. So in 2035, actually, this, for example, EIA is underestimating the LCOE, the cost of electricity you're going to produce by your power plant by around 7 times. So it's a big, it's a big difference. If I know the real LCOE of the coal power plant, I wouldn't invest it because it's obvious that it's much, much more expensive than the solar and the wind here. They are almost zero. So they're very cheap to operate. They're very cheap to produce electricity with compared to the coal. So we are actually, by doing this, by considering a constant capacity factor, we are actually exaggerating the financial profitability. We should call it a financial bubble. So we make it, more attractive than it really is in terms of its profitability. We are misleading investors by that. And if you invest in such a, for example, coal power plants, you will end up with you'll end up with, in the next couple of years, for example, you end up with a power plant which is sort of idle. So you're going to use it anymore, maybe 1%, 2% of the time in a whole year, or, just an extreme point, you'll just abandon it, which we call it stranded assets. So in a finance terms. So you invested a lot, you incur a lot of capital costs, operation costs, maintenance costs, and you cannot make money because your power plant, should be turned off. It's the simple as it is. And it's not only about the power plant. If you mislead a investor, if I just want to invest in a coal power plants, I signal the coal miners that mining more coals for me because I'm investing in a power plant. I want to just produce electricity in the next couple of years. So doing more mining. So just constructing more pipeline for the gas I need, or just shipping more LNG for the gas I need. So if you just, mislead an investor, it has a domino effect. You trigger a chain of effects across a chain of, a fossil fuel industry. And finally, just think about it. Almost all of us, not maybe exactly all of us, but almost all of us are investing in fossil fuel industry, even we don't know it. How? Just think about it. If you invest for example, in a bond, or in an investment project by a bank, the money you invest there, the money you lend the bank to invest in some projects, maybe go to the fossil-based projects, the power plants, or all of the things that I explained as a value chain of the fossil power plants. Or, for example, you or your parents invest in a governmental bonds. We're not sure whether those money invest in the fossil power plants or clean future. Or you or your parents, or even myself, our superannuation fund would be invested in fossil fuel power plants, which shouldn't be, and they should be directed to the cleaner ones. And just think about it. We had an assumption that I'm a pure profit maximizer. It's not a realistic assumption. All of us care about the future, the next generation, the environmental aspects, all of the things that Adam mentioned about the ocean, all of the other environmental things that we have. And if you take into account all of those factors, the answer is clearer than ever to which is the best option to invest in. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
I've got a question. This is Heath. Have you done this analysis on the Kurri power plant, the gas plant that the government has proposed and seems to be going ahead with?
It applies to any power plants, but specifically they themselves claim that they're gonna use it up to 2% of the time. So the capacity factor is around 2%. So it's virtually zero. Yeah. Bruce, do you want to add something to it? Because Bruce is more experienced than me about these new projects.
Yeah, Curry is a pretty ridiculous project. All in all, it's not needed for energy security, and that's according to the Australian Energy Market Operator. And if you look, Snowy Hydro owns Colongra, which is not very far at all from where Curry will be located. It's only just south of Newcastle Colongra, and it operated with a capacity factor of 0.9% last year. It was built and then purchased by Snowy Hydro at a price much lower than its cost of construction. Basically because they haven't, the previous owner couldn't make any money out of it. Look, we haven't actually done an LCOE on it, but you don't need to be a genius to work out that it's not going to compete with more batteries coming into the market.
Okay, good.
I'm curious what the reaction is that you've gotten from this report so far, Milad, Bruce, in the Australian context. I mean, does everybody already know this somehow, or and just doesn't want to admit it, or is it an open secret, or what's the story there? Why haven't people woken up to this and reacted to this? It's not like there's new information really in the Rethink X report or what you guys are doing somehow, right? It's a realization, but it could have happened 10 years ago, it seems, no?
Look, you go.
Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
I think when you look at it, these institutions are very hidebound by their existing thinking, and if you look at something like the CSIRO, for example, it is wholly a compromised institution now when it comes to energy, and it's a very unfortunate thing to say, but it's a wholly compromised institution. And a lot of the stuff coming out of there is not reliable information anymore. And I think that this is another example of it. It is pretty obvious that these capacity factors for fossil fuel plants are falling, and the economics are very real. You only have to look at AGL's share price to see that. AGL took a big bet on investing in coal, and it's been a big losing bet so far. But unfortunately, a lot of our institutions within Australia are compromised.
That's grim.
Exactly the same in the US.
Just to add.
So go ahead, Milad.
No, I wanted to add a more positive thing to what Bruce said, but we are trying to start a dialogue with them, just sending the report, for example, CSIRO, and say, let's just talk about it. Let's see what we think, what you have as a fact-based analysis, and just start this conversation. Hopefully, we're optimistic. Actually, we'll do our best to disseminate these types of reports.
The situation is the same in the U.S. With the government institutions like the Energy Information Administration, and I think it is a bit of an open secret. When we put out our analysis that showed that this was happening with a variety of different sort of usual suspects. We use the analogy of the credit rating agencies that were asleep at the wheel before the financial crisis in 2007 with the subprime mortgages in the U.S. It's a sort of an analogous situation. I think it's a bit of an open secret, and perhaps a few folks were thinking, well, it's not a very realistic assumption, but maybe we'll be off by a few percent, no big deal. I think there are a combination of factors that, no pun intended, but capacity factor, a combination of things that were going on. The first is that I don't think there was a really much of an appreciation for how far this capacity factor could really fall. I mean, if you're off by 5% or even 10%, maybe that's not the end of the world over a 20 or 30-year time frame. But if you're talking about going from 85%, which is the U.S. assumption from the Energy Information Administration, if you're talking about going from there to zero in a decade, or even faster, which is what's happening in the UK, then that's a very different situation. So I think part of it is just folks were not seeing clearly how rapidly the system can flip when the finances fall underwater for these power plants, because once they go underwater, everything goes to hell very quickly financially once their finances are properly underwater. So things flip very quickly. And I think the other thing, and this is funny for the mathematicians maybe involved, is the folks calculating this are not necessarily viewing their methodology with fresh eyes. One thing that I noticed, well, let me make a confession here, okay? When I first realized that people were assuming that capacity factor was constant when it should be dynamic, when it should be falling over time, I didn't realize that when I looked at the equation for LCOE, the actual calculation, which has got many other variables than the simplified version of just total costs over total electricity output. When it's calculated, it has a number of other variables, a number of other parameters in that function. But capacity factor is a constant in the standard equation. If you look it up on Wikipedia, if you look it up in any of the literature, and the equation is reported out, capacity factor is just sitting there as a constant. I think it was just lazy that people would, for years, for decades, that was a valid assumption. Just put it in as a constant, And I think it took a pair of fresh eyes to go in there and see that. But I didn't see it when I looked at the equation. I saw it when I graphed it in Excel. And when I saw it annually, and I saw the bar chart, year after year, it's the same amount of electricity. I thought, what? Wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense. But I didn't see it when I was just looking at the equation and it was a constant. That was my feeling. I'm not a mathematician. Maybe, certainly brighter folks than me would have realized that quickly. But I think that may be part of what's going on. Is the methodology had just been inherited and was old and had become invalid, and nobody really realized it. And then maybe when they did, they thought, oh shit, our last 10 years have been nonsense. Oh, what do we do? Maybe we just maybe we won't advertise the fact that this is all wrong. Maybe we'll just keep going. But that's not much of an excuse for the private folks like Lazard and Bloomberg New Energy Finance and the other sort of prominent consultants and private agencies that advise investors. They don't have as much of an excuse. The big agencies, the government ones, have certainly they're captured by industry and all that stuff. But yeah, I'm surprised that the banks and so forth that they didn't catch it sooner. It's been weird. I've got a question for you guys, Milad and Bruce. For Australia, is there any sign of the capacity factor for coal? We see that's in decline. Is there any sign that the gas is in decline yet, or is it still too early for that? Because in the U.S., coal originally got disrupted not by solar and wind, but by cheap gas from fracking in the U.S. And now, just going back to 2010, 2011, that's why coal's capacity factor started to fall. It was mainly because of cheap gas, and then now it's continuing. It's really accelerating downward because of now competition from super cheap solar and wind. But gas is still sort of hanging in there, and we expect to see the capacity factor fall, but we haven't seen it yet. Are you guys seeing that in Australia, or is it still just coal?
Yeah, I think it's already declining in Australia. Started from 10 years ago, but yes, if we just categorize them to gas peakers, for gas peakers it is declining, but with not a short slope. But for combined cycle one, it's already declining, and it's obvious in the data.
Wow, that's awesome.
Just to explain to people out there what Milad's saying, the combined cycle plants are gas baseload plants, right? They run all the time, and the open cycle plants are the gas peakers, the ones that only operate when there's not when the prices are very high. I just thought I'd better clarify that for everyone. Go on, Milad.
No, that's what I want to say. Thanks for clarification.
Yeah. Just one other thing. When we're just to give you some Australian context to this, gas use in gas-fired power stations has fallen 67% since 2014. So we're using an awful lot less gas to produce power in Australia. The gas that's being burnt is mainly being burnt now in gas peakers, and gas baseload plants really are exiting the system.
In my understanding, again, Heath, as well as and Milad and Bruce, you guys are all experts on Australia, but the and I'm just looking at it from a distance. But as far as I can tell from what I've seen, just the performance of basically the mega batteries, I think the Hornsdale Power Reserve that Tesla put in back in 2017 was one of the earlier examples of that. But my understanding is that their performance is just amazing compared to gas peakers. That there's just no contest. That's my impression. Is that still correct? Is that being borne out that there's being it's very gas peakers to compete with batteries? They're just on a raw performance level. Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah, basically yes. In Australia, they also supply what's called the frequency control and ancillary market, which is a strange market that our national electricity market has to control the frequency in the grid. So they actually sell services as well as energy. So it's important to note. But the Hornsdale Power Reserve has been fabulously profitable for the owner of it, and they are finding they have similar economic characteristics to other renewables, batteries. They have similar economic characteristics. In other words, once they're high capital cost, but once you've built them, you will run them if you can just make a small arbitrage between the low price of the day and the high price. And that's why gas can't compete, because gas actually needs a certain price per megawatt hour. Batteries only need a differential between one price and another for them to operate every day. Does that make sense? So as we get more and more batteries in the system, gas will find it harder and harder to compete, because a battery's cost is all up front, and the energy cost is only the differential between your buy price and the sell price. It doesn't have a cost like so many dollars per gigajoule that gas does, where they've actually got to buy the gas.
There's also one more factor, and I might be getting a bit too technical here, but the Australian energy and electricity market kind of has two different time settings at the moment. So every 5 minutes the price is set, but settlements only occur every 30 minutes, which means that if there's a high price in one 5-minute interval, a gas peaker can turn on later and still capture some of that high price. But what's happening as of October 1st is that 30-minute settlement period is going away and everything is 5 minutes. So all of these gas peakers are going to really struggle to compete with batteries in that scenario.
That's really interesting. That I had not heard about. Okay, that's very, very interesting to hear. Wow.
It'll be fascinating to watch.
Yeah, the 5 seconds is really going to change things. It changes everything, and it will make. We are seeing an awful lot of battery projects being proposed at the moment in the national electricity market, and if you're a betting person, you'd say that a lot of them will actually get built. There's huge capacity being proposed, and when you look at the battery projects, what are you looking for? You're looking at someone who's got the financial ability to build them, someone with a connection point, and someone with land at that connection point, right? And if you look at the battery projects, nearly all of them have all three lined up. There's a couple that don't, but nearly all of them have those three things. They've got access to finance, they've got a connection point, and they've got land at that connection point. So a lot of them will go ahead, and there are an awful lot proposed. So it's going to be a pretty transformative time in Australia in the next 12 to 18 months, in a positive sense.
Great.
Despite
Thanks.
governments.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'd be interested at some point to go through the specific proposals in Ross Garnaut's book and sort of get an idea maybe from you, Heath, or somebody who's in the know about who's thinking about them. And I mean, specific things like he was talking there about desalination plants in South Australia and hydroponic farms based on that. And I mean, there's lots of very specific proposals in there. I'm curious where those stand. But for the moment, maybe we'll continue the conversation, but I want to give everybody a chance to thank the speakers. So thanks, Milad. Thanks, Bruce. That was great. And I want to thank all the speakers for today. So thanks, Heath. Thanks, Adam.